The dawn of 1945 did not bring peace, but a fundamental transformation of conflict. The world witnessed the cessation of industrial-scale warfare, only to see it immediately replaced by a silent, shadow war fought not with rifles and tanks, but with file folders, intelligence dossiers, and a chillingly pragmatic calculus of strategic advantage. As the Third Reich crumbled, consumed by the self-immolating fire it had ignited across the European continent, the conventional battlefields fell silent. In their place, a new, desperate competition began, orchestrated not by field marshals, but by intelligence officers and military technocrats who understood with terrifying clarity that the next great struggle would be won in the laboratory, the wind tunnel and the vacuum chamber, not the trench. This was a race not for cities or resources, but for men, the human repositories of forbidden knowledge, hidden in plain sight, tucked away in underground factories burrowed deep into mountains, in sophisticated aerodynamic research centers, and in isolated scientific enclaves disguised as rustic inns, were the master architects of the Nazi technological renaissance. These were the scientists and engineers who had conceived and birthed the V2 rocket, a weapon that tore through the stratosphere, arcing to the edge of space itself before plunging down to rainfire and psychic terror on London and Antwerp. Their war was over, but their value was incalculable, transcendent. They held the keys to the next great leap in human capability, keys that could unlock the heavens, forge even more terrible weapons for the looming conflict, or irrevocably tilt the global balance of power for the next half-century. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, a clandestine mission born in the moral quagmire of a receding war, a Faustian bargain struck in the name of national survival that would forever alter the trajectory of the 20th century, set the incendiary stage for the Cold War, and ultimately catapult humanity on a course for the stars. It is a tale of ruthless pragmatism, unparalleled scientific genius, profound ethical compromise, and the long, dark shadows cast by the relentless pursuit of victory and knowledge. The stage for this silent war was the smouldering, corpse-strewn landscape of Germany in the spring of 1945. The very air was thick with the acrid perfume of cordite, burning rubble, and death. A constant, grim reminder of the apocalypse that had just passed. Iconic cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Cologne were reduced to skeletal remains, their grand cathedrals and civic buildings standing as hollowed-out shells against a smoke-choked sky. Yet, amidst this vast panorama of devastation, the German countryside concealed a sophisticated and largely intact network of scientific enclaves, deliberately placed far from the bombers' flight paths and often buried deep underground. One such place was the Heeresversuchsanstalt Peenemünde, a remote, state-of-the-art research facility on the windswept Usedom Island on the Baltic coast. Here, amidst the whispering pine forests and imposing concrete bunkers, a team of brilliant engineers led by a young, charismatic, and fiercely ambitious visionary named Wernher von Braun had achieved what was once considered the pure stuff of science fiction. They had created the A4, better known to the world through Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine as the V2, the Vergeltungswaffe 2 or Vengeance Weapon 2, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It was a weapon of stunning complexity and profound psychological impact, a 46-foot-tall spear of liquid-fueled fury, powered by a volatile cryogenic mixture of ethanol and liquid oxygen. It traveled at over 3,500 miles per hour, 5 times the speed of sound, arcing 60 miles into the void of near space before plunging silently onto its target, its supersonic descent ensuring the shattering explosion arrived before the sound of its terrifying approach, a ghostly herald of its own destruction. But for von Braun and his inner circle of true believers, men like Walter Dornberger and Arthur Rudolph, the V2 was never merely a weapon. It was a stepping stone, a necessary evil and a practical prototype for a vehicle that could one day travel to the moon and beyond. This fundamental, defining duality, the creation of a terror weapon as a means to a celestial, almost spiritual end, would come to define the entire Paperclip story and the intractable moral quandary at its heart. As the Soviet Second Belarusian Front advanced relentlessly from the east and the US First Army pushed forward from the west, the scientists at Peenemünde and other secret facilities faced a stark, binary choice. Be captured by the Soviets, who would likely work them to death in some remote, frozen Siberian gulag, or surrender to the Americans, who represented the best and perhaps only chance of continuing their life's work and realizing their cosmic ambitions. The American effort to secure this unprecedented scientific prize was far from an ad hoc scramble. It was a meticulously planned, top-secret operation born from a prescient and grim understanding of the coming geopolitical shift. Even before the war in Europe had officially ended, key figures in US intelligence, the War Department, and the scientific establishment were already planning for the aftermath, their eyes fixed on the technological horizon. In the summer of 1945, as the Potsdam Conference redrew the map of Europe in the first, faint cracks in the alliance with the Soviet Union began to widen into chasms. President Harry S. Truman authorized a program to systematically exploit German scientific and technical expertise. The official directive, known as the Exploitation of German Specialists in Science and Technology in the United States, contained a crucial, and what would become a famously and repeatedly violated caveat. Truman's order explicitly forbade bringing into the United States any individuals who had been members of the Nazi Party and more than nominal participants in its activities, or active supporters of Nazism or militarism. This was the official policy, a clear line drawn in the sand of American morality, a reflection of the very ideals for which the nation had just fought a brutal and costly war. But on the ground, for the pragmatic officers of the newly formed Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, WWII, this was an impossible constraint that threatened to hand the greatest scientific minds of the Third Reich to the Soviets on a silver platter. The men they sought, the true geniuses behind the V-2, the Me-262 jet fighter, advanced synthetic fuels, infrared optics, and chemical weapons, were not apolitical technicians living in an ivory tower. To have risen to positions of authority and received lavish funding within the tightly controlled, ideologically driven apparatus of the Third Reich, they were, by stark necessity, deeply complicit. They were often mandatory members of the Nazi Party, and many, like von Braun, held officer ranks in the SS, the very embodiment of Nazi terror and racial ideology. The men tasked with recruitment, like the US Army's Major Robert B. Staver, understood this damning dichotomy immediately. The choice was stark and unforgiving. Adhere to the strict letter of the policy and lose the scientists to the Soviets, guaranteeing a catastrophic strategic disadvantage in the coming conflict, or find a way to systematically bypass it. They chose the latter consciously, deliberately, and with bureaucratic efficiency. Thus, Operation Paperclip was born, named for the simple paperclips used by WWII officers to attach new, sanitized biographies to the scientists' files, effectively whitewashing their Nazi pasts and repackaging them as mere technical assets. Their moral baggage conveniently left on the European shore. It was a deliberate, sustained act of historical revisionism and legal circumvention, all conducted under the solemn, overriding banner of national security and the emerging doctrine of containment against the Soviet threat. The most coveted prize, the undisputed crown jewel of the entire operation, was Wernher von Braun himself. A master of political navigation as well as rocketry, von Braun understood the shifting tides of power with the acuity of a statesman. In the final, chaotic months of the war, he proactively and cunningly engineered his own surrender to the Americans. He deliberately disobeyed a direct order from the SS to evacuate his entire team to a final, fanatical redoubt in the Alps, where they would have become hostages or been executed to prevent their capture. Instead, he orchestrated a complex and perilous exodus of his core team of over 500 top rocket scientists, engineers and their families, moving them south from Peenemünde in a carefully managed convoy into the path of the advancing US 7th Army in Bavaria. It was a calculated gamble with their lives, a high-stakes bet that the Americans would value their knowledge more than they would punish their past. On May 2, 1945, just days after Hitler's suicide, von Braun's younger brother and fellow engineer Magnus cycled out onto a country road near the Bavarian town of Reuter and, in broken English, surrendered to a bewildered private from the US 44th Infantry Division. The Americans had hit the intelligence jackpot, but what they uncovered was not just a group of brilliant, cooperative minds. They found a man with a complex and deeply troubling history that directly and flagrantly contradicted President Truman's explicit orders. Wernher von Braun was not merely a scientist coerced by a totalitarian regime. He was a major in the SS, Sturmbannführer, personally promoted by Heinrich Himmler, who had taken a keen and manipulative interest in the rocket program. More damningly, he had been the technical director of a program that relied on tens of thousands of slave laborers from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp to build his V-2 rockets in a hellish, underground factory complex called Mittelwerk. These prisoners, living in subterranean caves without sunlight, sanitation, or adequate food, worked under unimaginably brutal conditions overseen by SS guards. It is estimated that more people died building the V2s, some 20,000 from exhaustion, disease, starvation, and execution, than were killed by the missiles themselves in their operational deployment. Von Braun had been a frequent and necessary visitor to the facility, needing to resolve technical issues and production bottlenecks on the assembly line. He had undoubtedly seen the emaciated bodies, the public hangings used to enforce discipline, the sheer, industrial-scale human cost of his technological ambition. His complicity was active, undeniable, and stained with the blood of thousands. Yet, when interrogated by US intelligence officers at a secret facility known as Dustbin in Castle Kranzberg, von Braun was the picture of charming, urbane, and enthusiastic cooperation. He skillfully presented himself as a man of science, an idealist trapped by circumstance, his eyes always fixed on the stars. His involvement with the Nazi regime, a regrettable but necessary compromise to fund his research. He and his team provided the Americans with an unparalleled treasure trove of documents, including a secret hidden archive of their research comprising over 14 tons of blueprints, test data, and theoretical papers smuggled into an abandoned mine shaft at Durnton to keep it from the advancing Soviets. The intelligence coup was so monumental, the data so profoundly valuable, that it rapidly overwhelmed the initial moral qualms of his military and intelligence handlers. The GOA went to work with ruthless bureaucratic efficiency, systematically erasing the most incriminating evidence from his file. His SS membership and his direct, intimate involvement with the slave labor at Mittelwerk were minimized, explained away as nominal or a simple requirement of his position, or omitted entirely from the official record. Wernher von Braun, the SS Sturmbannführer and beneficiary of concentration camp labor, was meticulously reborn for American consumption as Dr. Wernher von Braun, the visionary rocket pioneer, spaceflight advocate, and future American hero. But von Braun was merely the most famous and public face of a much larger, more diverse and more disturbing migration, a veritable brain drain of Nazi scientific talent. Operation Paperclip would eventually bring over 1,600 German scientists, engineers and technicians to the United States, along with their families, in a mass transfer of intellectual capital unprecedented in history. They came from every conceivable field of advanced Nazi military research, forming a complete technological package. There was Hubertus Strughold, later hailed as the father of space medicine, who had directed the Aeromedical Research Institute in Berlin. There, he had conducted or overseen cruel and often lethal high-altitude and freezing experiments on prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp. His work, which involved subjecting victims to vacuum chambers to simulate explosive decompression at 60,000 feet and immersing them in icy water to test survival times for pilots downed over the North Sea, was later classified at the Nuremberg doctors' trial as crimes against humanity. Yet his unique, if horrifically acquired, knowledge of the human body's limits in extreme environments was deemed absolutely vital for the coming age of high-altitude jet flight and, eventually, space flight. The US Air Force, desperate for this biomedical edge, brought him over, whitewashed his record, and installed him as the chief scientist of the Department of Space Medicine at the Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine, where he played a pivotal role in designing pressure suits and life support systems for the X-15 and Mercury programs. His past was buried so deep that a major award for space medicine was later named in his honor. There was Kurt de Boos, another dedicated SS member, and the V2 flight test director at Peenemünde, a brilliant engineer who would go on to become the first director of the Kennedy Space Center, personally overseeing the launches of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions from the very same launch complex that would send Americans to the moon. There was Arthur Rudolph, the operational director of the Mittelwerk factory, the man directly responsible for meeting the SS's brutal V2 production quotas using the slave labor force, who would later become a naturalized US citizen and a key figure in the American rocket program, managing the development of the Pershing missile and, most famously, the monumental Saturn V rocket that would take Americans to the moon. For the GOA and the US military, these men's pasts were an inconvenient truth, a moral burden to be carried silently and without complaint. For the greater strategic prize of winning the technological arms race that was already taking terrifying shape. The initial home for these scientists on American soil was a carefully, controlled and isolated environment designed to both utilize and contain them, a gilded cage of knowledge. They were first housed at Fort Bliss, Texas, a sprawling sun-baked army installation on the edge of El Paso, a world away from the forests and mountains of Germany. The contrast was jarring, almost surreal. They had gone from the war-torn, rubble-strewn landscapes of Europe to the stark, immense and dust-choked desert of the American Southwest. Their work began in earnest at the nearby White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, a landscape of stark beauty that eerily mirrored the Baltic coast of Peenemünde. Here they were tasked with assembling, testing, and launching captured V-2 rockets, essentially teaching a new generation of American engineers the hard-won secrets of large-scale liquid-fueled rocketry. It was a strange and often psychologically tense partnership. The German scientists, though well-paid, comfortably housed, and treated with a professional respect they had not necessarily expected, were essentially high-value prisoners of war with special privileges, their movements constantly monitored and their mail censored. The American engineers, many of whom had fought their way across Europe and had personally witnessed the horrors of liberated Nazi concentration camps, were often deeply suspicious, resentful, and morally conflicted, forced to collaborate professionally with men who had so recently been the embodiment of the enemy. Yet, driven by the overwhelming urgency of the emerging Cold War, the work progressed at a breathtaking, relentless pace. The V-2, in American hands, was transformed from a weapon of terror into a platform for unprecedented scientific discovery. The rockets, now dubbed Hermes, were fitted with an array of scientific instruments, cosmic ray detectors, spectrographs, cameras, and atmospheric samplers, and launched to the upper atmosphere, giving American scientists their first direct data on solar radiation, the ionosphere, and the conditions at the very edge of space. It was the glorious birth of American space science, and it was built directly, unambiguously, upon a Nazi technological foundation. The very first pictures of the Earth's curvature from space were taken by a camera on a launched V-2 in 1946, a poignant and powerful symbol of how a tool of war was being repurposed for peaceful exploration and the pursuit of knowledge. The rapidly escalating context of the Cold War provided the relentless, overriding impetus for this profound and deliberate moral compromise. As the grand, fragile alliance with the Soviet Union shattered into mutual hostility, deep-seated suspicion and paranoia, the strategic value of the German scientists skyrocketed. The Soviet Union had in fact run its own, even more aggressive and less discriminating version of Paperclip, dubbed Operation Oswiecim. On a single night in October 1946, Soviet NKVD troops rounded up thousands of German technicians, scientists, and their families, over 2,200 people in total, and forcibly shipped them to the USSR in a brutal and efficient operation to jumpstart their missile and aviation programs. The arms race was not just on. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing sprint for survival, and it was a race the United States could not afford to lose. The detonation of the first Soviet atomic bomb, First Lightning, in August 1949, years ahead of American predictions, sent a seismic shockwave through the corridors of power in Washington, shattering the comforting illusion of a lasting nuclear monopoly and creating a state of permanent, high-alert crisis. The subsequent intelligence that the Soviets, led by their own brilliant and secretive German rocket expert, Sergei Korolev, were advancing with alarming speed in rocket technology, spawned a pervasive missile gap panic. In this fevered atmosphere, the Paperclip scientists were no longer just a valuable asset. They were a strategic imperative, the only men on Earth with the hands-on, battle-tested experience to close the gap and counter the Soviet threat. Any lingering ethical concerns within the State Department or other civilian agencies were systematically suppressed, overridden, or simply ignored by the unified national security apparatus. When the State Department, following the clear, unambiguous guidelines of Truman's directive, raised formal, written objections about the clear and documented Nazi pasts of certain scientists, the WWII, under the powerful direction of the Pentagon, simply circumvented them. They created special internal security committees that provided a rubber stamp approval process, arguing in classified memos that the scientists' intelligence value and their fervent anti-communist stance categorically outweighed any potential security risk or historical moral failing they might pose. The files were not just sanitized. In many cases, they were actively, knowingly, and fraudulently doctored. Nazi affiliations were described as nominal or necessary for career advancement, and concrete. Corroborated evidence of war crimes involvement was glossed over as unsubstantiated allegations or the unfortunate but unavoidable reality of working within a totalitarian system. The end, national survival in a terrifyingly bipolar world, justified the means on an industrial, bureaucratic scale. The center of gravity for the Paperclip operation soon shifted from the wide-open deserts of Texas and New Mexico to a new frontier in the American South, Huntsville, Alabama. In 1950, the entire German rocket team, led by von Braun, was transferred to the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville. This move marked a critical and symbolic transition in their status and integration into the American fabric. They were no longer just consultants or monitored prisoners. They were being formally integrated into the very heart of the American military-industrial complex, tasked with designing and building the next generation of American strategic missiles. The Army established the rocket branch at Redstone, with von Braun as its chief, granting him and his team an unprecedented level of authority, responsibility, and resources. Here the Germans, now joined by a growing and immensely talented cadre of young American engineers, began designing the weapons that would define the early, tense years of the Cold War. Their first major creation was the PGM-11 Redstone, a direct evolved descendant of the V2. It was a mobile, short-range ballistic missile designed to carry a nuclear warhead, a key component of America's theater-level deterrent in Europe. The Redstone was essentially a larger, more reliable, and more powerful V2, a living testament to the foundational knowledge and practical experience the Paperclip team had brought with them across the Atlantic. But von Braun's ambitions and his genius for public relations and visionary storytelling always stretched far beyond the confines of weapons development. He was a master showman and a charismatic spokesman who used mass circulation magazines like Collier's to sell the American public on a breathtaking, detailed vision of the future, a vision featuring giant, wheel-shaped space stations, manned missions to the moon, and ambitious expeditions to Mars. He understood, with the clarity of a prophet, that to ultimately achieve his childhood dreams of spaceflight, he needed to capture the imagination of the nation and create a powerful public mandate for a massive civilian-led space program. He was patiently, skillfully laying the groundwork for a future that transcended the missile race, a future he had dreamed of since his youth in Germany. The single event that truly cemented the indispensable value of Operation Paperclip and fully launched the American space program into the public consciousness and onto the national priority list was the shocking, traumatic launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik 1 on October 4, 1957. The simple, relentless beep-beep-beep radio signal from the first man-made object in orbit was not a triumph of science for America. It was a technological Pearl Harbor, a profound shock to the national psyche that triggered a deep crisis of confidence and demonstrated a terrifying perceived technological and ideological gap. The United States, the self-proclaimed leader of the free world and the bastion of technological prowess, had been beaten, and humiliatingly so, by the communist state it despised and feared. Panic, embarrassment, and a visceral sense of vulnerability gripped Washington and the nation. The public and politicians alike demanded an immediate, dramatic, and visible response. In this moment of profound national anxiety and wounded pride, the government and the military turned almost instinctively to the only men on the planet who had the practical experience, the proven track record, and the ready-made, sitting on a shelf designs to respond swiftly. Wernher von Braun and his German team at Redstone Arsenal. They had been waiting for this precise moment for over a decade, refining their designs and lobbying tirelessly for a chance to launch an American satellite. The Army, seizing the opportunity to reclaim the initiative, quickly greenlit a project that von Braun and his deputy, Eberhard Ries, had been preparing for years. With the entire world watching, on the evening of January 31st, 1958, a Jupiter C rocket, a modified and upgraded Redstone developed by von Braun's team, lifted off from Cape Canaveral and, after a tense, agonizing wait, successfully placed America's first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. The national humiliation was partially and dramatically assuaged. The success of Explorer 1, which also famously discovered the Van Allen radiation belts, was a direct and undeniable result of the technological foundation, the engineering talent, and the relentless drive built by the Paperclip scientists over the preceding 12 years. It was their expertise, their designs, and their leadership that had allowed the United States to close the perceived gap with the Soviets in a mere matter of months. In the wake of the Sputnik crisis and the redemptive success of Explorer 1, the US government moved to consolidate its various competing and often redundant space and missile research efforts under a single, civilian-led agency. On July 29, 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. The era of the space race had officially, explosively begun, and the Paperclip engineers, now naturalized American citizens and public heroes, were transferred from the Army to become the foundational pillars, the irreplaceable core of this new civilian agency. With the creation of NASA, the German rocket team found its ultimate, legitimizing and triumphant home. The George C. Marshall Space Flight Center was established in Huntsville, Alabama, and Wernher von Braun was appointed its first director. The men who had once designed and built weapons of terror for the Third Reich were now the chief architects and managers of America's peaceful, scientific, and idealistic exploration of space. It was one of the most profound, ironic, and consequential transformations in modern history. At Marshall, von Braun assembled his old Peenemünde team and gave them leadership over the most ambitious, complex, and expensive engineering project the world had ever witnessed. Their mandate, set by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 in a speech to a joint session of Congress, was breathtakingly audacious. Before the decade was out, land an American on the moon and return him safely to Earth. The result of this national mobilization, this immense concentration of will and resources, was the Saturn family of rockets. The Saturn I and the more powerful Saturn IB were formidable machines that tested hardware and crews in Earth orbit. But the crown jewel, the vehicle that would make the lunar landing a physical possibility, was the Saturn V, standing 363 feet tall, a gleaming white skyscraper lying on its side, generating a ground-shaking, earth-trembling 7.5 million pounds of thrust from its 5 massive F1 engines in the first stage. The Saturn V was a leviathan of pure, controlled power. It was the tangible, magnificent culmination of all the knowledge, all the research, all the failures and hard-won successes, and all the practical experience that had begun in the workshops and test stands of Peenemünde and had been paid for with the blood, suffering, and lives of thousands in the hellish tunnels of Mittelwerk. Arthur Rudolph, the former production manager at Mittelwerk, was appointed the project manager for the Saturn V. Under his notoriously meticulous, driven and demanding direction, the rocket was built, a masterpiece of systems engineering, logistics, and management that remains the most powerful, complex, and reliable vehicle ever launched by humanity. The moral chasm between the means and the end had never been wider or more starkly illustrated. The rocket that would fulfill a democratic nation's promise, that would realize a dream of human exploration and unite the world in awe, was being shepherded into existence by men whose hands were indelibly stained with the blood of slave laborers, their pasts a dark, open secret buried deep beneath the gleaming, triumphant facade of technical achievement. The climax of this decades-long, morally fraught journey came on the humid morning of July 16, 1969. The air at the Kennedy Space Center crackled with almost unbearable anticipation as the Saturn V, carrying the Apollo 11 crew, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, stood poised and majestic on Launch Complex 39A, gleaming like a cathedral spire in the powerful xenon spotlights. In the firing room, a nervous but supremely confident Wernher von Braun and his team of American and German engineers monitored the final, critical systems checks, the weight of a decade of frantic work and a nation's soaring expectations on their shoulders. The countdown echoed through the sweltering Florida pre-dawn, each number a step closer to history. When the engines ignited, it was not merely a launch, it was a primal visceral event. The ground itself seemed to tremble and groan, the roar a physical, chest-pounding force that washed over the million spectators who had gathered to witness the event. As the colossal rocket slowly, agonizingly, and then majestically climbed into the pinkish-grey sky, tracing a fiery, purposeful arc over the Atlantic, it represented the ultimate, triumphant vindication of the paperclip gamble. It was the moment the immense investment, the profound moral compromise, and the wholesale technological transfer paid the ultimate historic dividend. 4 days later, when Neil Armstrong's boot pressed into the fine, grey lunar dust, it was a victory for all humanity, a moment of transcendent achievement that temporarily united the world in awe and wonder. But in the control rooms and engineering centers back on Earth, That victory was built upon a foundation laid, in no small part, by men who had once willingly served a regime of unparalleled evil. The television cameras showed the smiling, confident, and celebratory face of Wernher von Braun, the celebrated American hero and genius. They did not show, and a willfully forgetful America did not wish to see, the ghosts of Mittelbau-Dora, the thousands of nameless, faceless victims whose suffering in the dark, cold tunnels of the Harz Mountains was the unspoken, hidden, and terrible price of humanity's first journey to another world. In the years that followed the Apollo triumph, the carefully constructed facades surrounding the Paperclip scientists began, slowly and painfully, to crack and resurface. The work of dogged journalists, tenacious historians, and relentless Nazi hunters, such as Eli Rosenbaum, who would later lead the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, OSI, started to peel back the layers of whitewash applied decades before by the JIOA. Using the Freedom of Information Act, they unearthed the original, unsanitized files that contained the damning, incontrovertible evidence of SS memberships and direct involvement with war crimes that had been deliberately overlooked, minimized, or buried. In the 1980s, facing new, overwhelming evidence and the looming threat of prosecution for his activities at Mittelwerk, Arthur Rudolph, the celebrated father of the Saturn V, was confronted by the OSI. To avoid a formal public trial for war crimes, he made a deal with the US government in 1984. He agreed to renounce his American citizenship, which had been granted based on a fraudulently vetted application, and leave the country permanently in exchange for not being prosecuted. He returned to West Germany a free but disgraced man, a stark and belated acknowledgement of the crimes that had been strategically ignored for 4 decades in the service of the space race. Other cases were investigated, including those of Kurt de Boos and Hubertus Strughold, though few saw any real justice beyond public exposure and historical condemnation. The legacy of Operation Paperclip is thus one of profound and enduring moral ambiguity, a subject of intense and ongoing historical and ethical debate. On one hand, its strategic and technological success is undeniable and monumental in scale. It provided the United States with a quantum leap in rocketry, aviation, medicine, and materials science that was absolutely critical in winning the Cold War. The rockets that launched American spy satellites, put men on the moon, established global communications networks, and formed the backbone of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent were direct descendants of the V2 and the brilliant, if morally compromised, brains that conceived it. It was, from a purely pragmatic, realpolitik, and geopolitical standpoint, an undeniable masterstroke that decisively shaped the second half of the 20th century. On the other hand, the operation represented a fundamental and deliberate compromise of the very principles for which the war had been fought, the principles of justice, accountability, and the categorical rejection of totalitarian evil. The United States had stood in solemn judgment at the Nuremberg trials, condemning the Nazis for crimes against humanity and establishing a new standard of international law, yet it had simultaneously and knowingly recruited, sheltered, honored, and employed individuals who were directly complicit in those very crimes. It traded justice for knowledge, morality for power, and principle for pragmatism on a grand scale. The scientists themselves lived complex, compartmentalized lives, rarely if ever fully acknowledging their personal culpability, often retreating behind the facile defense of being apolitical men of science or helpless victims of circumstance. A self-serving narrative that the vast majority of them took to their graves. The truth, as it so often is, was far messier, more nuanced, and more uncomfortable. They were both brilliant visionaries who expanded the horizon of human possibility and willing, ambitious servants of a monstrous regime, men who consciously turned a blind eye to unimaginable suffering in the relentless pursuit of their goals. Operation Paperclip stands as a permanent, sobering lesson in the impossibly difficult choices that nations face in times of perceived existential threat. It demonstrates the terrifying allure of technological superiority and the chilling lengths to which a nation, even a fundamentally moral one, will go to secure it. It forces us to ask the most uncomfortable of questions. How much of our soul, of our core values, are we willing to trade for our survival and for our dreams? The Saturn V rocket remains an enduring monument to human ingenuity, courage, and the boundless potential of the human spirit to reach for the heavens. But it is also forever a silent memorial to the thousands of nameless, faceless victims whose suffering in the dark, cold tunnels of Mittelwerk was the unspoken, hidden and tragic price of a journey to the moon. The legacy of Paperclip is the legacy of the 20th century itself, written in rocket fire and human ash. A story of magnificent, world-changing achievement, forever and inextricably shadowed by the profound darkness from which it emerged.